Montana Territory, September 1878. The rain had been falling for hours, cold and mean, drumming steady against the roofs of White Hollow's wooden buildings. It was the kind of storm that painted everything gray from the muddy main road to the hearts of the people passing through. Gideon Steller stepped off the porch of the saloon, collar pulled high, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He had not planned to stay long in White Hollow, just long enough to trade 2 horses and move on, but something in the air made him pause something more than the sharp bite of rain. A sound, faint, broken, a cough. He turned his head, squinting through the downpour. There, slumped against the side of the general store, soaked through and shivering, was a woman. Not just a woman young, maybe 20 or 21, her dress torn at the shoulder, mud on her palms, hair matted to her face. She looked like she had been dropped from the sky and left to rot. She did not even look up when he approached. "Miss," Gideon said, crouching beside her. Her lips were blue. "Can you hear me?" She blinked slowly, as if pulling herself back from someplace far away. Her voice was hoarse. I do not know where I am. You are in White Hollow. Name is Gideon Steller. I am not going to hurt you." The woman trembled harder, as if the cold had just reached her bones. He pulled off his oilskin coat and wrapped it around her. She flinched, but did not pull away. "You are safe," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging around them. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. "They left me." "Who did?" She shook her head, curling into herself. Her jaw clenched like she was trying to hold something in. Gideon glanced toward the saloon. No one had come out. No one cared. He looked back down at her and gently tucked the coat tighter around her shoulders. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you warm." She tried to stand, faltered. Gideon caught her without effort, lifting her into his arms. Her body was light, frighteningly so. She pressed her face to his chest, too weak to protest. His rented room above the livery was small and plain, but dry. He laid her on the bed, then stoked the potbelly stove until the room began to thaw. She barely moved. He knelt beside her with a dry cloth and began to gently dab at her face. "What is your name?" A pause, then in a whisper. "Hattie Fallow." "All right, Hattie, you are going to be all right." The wind howled outside. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her fingers clutched the coat around her like it was the only thing tethering her to life. "I have nowhere to go," she said without looking at him. "You do now." Her eyes flicked up, uncertain. "Why? I do not leave people in the street. That is not who I am." She stared at him for a long second, as if trying to read something buried in his face. Then she lowered her head and whispered, "Thank you." By morning, her fever had broken. She sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the steam rise from a chipped mug of tea. Gideon stood by the window, arms crossed. "You want to tell me what happened?" Hattie looked down at her cup. "We came from Kansas, me, my father, and my cousin. He said there was work out west. We made it to Bozeman, but my cousin, he sold the wagon, took the horses. My father died 2 days later." Gideon took a slow breath. "What happened after that?" "I tried to get work, cleaning, serving, anything, but I had no money, no one to speak for me. A man told me he would take me to Helena for a job. Instead, he brought me here, said I owed him, that I belonged to him now." Her voice broke. "I ran, he caught me. Then he beat me and left me in the street." Gideon's hands fisted at his sides. "What is his name?" "I do not know. He just called himself boss." Gideon nodded once. "He is not going to hurt you again." She looked up at him, and he saw it under the fear and exhaustion, something strong. "Not broken, just bruised. I will find work," she said. "I will pay you back. I did not help you for coin, Hattie. I cannot be someone's burden." "You are not." She blinked, eyes shining. "Why are you being kind to me?" He walked over, crouched in front of her again. "Because you matter. Because no one should be left in the rain like that, and because I want you to feel safe." Her lip trembled. "I do not know how to do that anymore." "Then I will teach you." That night, she slept under his roof again, this time not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she chose to. Gideon lay on the floor beside the stove, keeping the fire alive while she rested. He watched her chest rise and fall slow and even. She looked different in sleep, peaceful. He knew he should leave soon. He never stayed long anywhere, but something about her pulled at him like a rope around the ribs. The next morning, she was the one who made the tea. "I will clean and cook," she said simply. "You saved me. I can at least make myself useful. You do not owe me anything." "I want to stay." He met her eyes. "Then stay." She smiled. A small thing, but it stayed with him the whole day. Gideon found himself bringing her a book from the mercantile, and she read by lantern light while he cleaned his rifle. She laughed for the first time that week over a burnt loaf of bread, and Gideon found himself grinning like a fool. When she brushed her hand against his as she passed him a plate, his chest tightened in a way he had not felt in years. He had not come to White Hollow looking for anything. But now he was watching the rain fall outside the window and wondering what it would be like to never leave. And Hattie, who had been left in the street, in the rain, with nothing, was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could belong somewhere again. With him. The autumn wind swept quiet through White Hollow's southern edge, past the livery, past the haphazard row of homesteader plots where the grass bent low with the season's turn. Inside the stable loft, Gideon leaned against a beam, arms dusted with hay, watching Hattie as she folded linens he'd forgotten he even owned. She moved slow, deliberate, her fingers careful around frayed edges. She hadn't asked for anything that morning. Just rose with the sun, tied her hair back with a scrap of muslin, and started setting things to order like the room belonged to her as much as it did to him. Gideon ran a hand across his jaw. "You ever do any riding?" Hattie didn't look up. "Bareback once, when I was 13. Horse belonged to the neighbor boy. He dared me. You fall," I stayed on. He didn't speak to me for a week after. He smiled faintly and pushed off the beam. "Come on. Let's see if we can find you a saddle that won't toss you." The mare he picked was a chestnut quarter horse with a calm eye, old enough to be steady but still sound in the legs. Hattie hesitated before approaching, her hand hovering near the animal's neck. "She'll let you," Gideon said. "I haven't touched a horse in 6 years. Then she's overdue for it." Hattie laid her hand against the horse's coat. The mare snorted gently, shifting her weight. Hattie's shoulders loosened just a little. They rode out past the creek, where the cottonwoods shed gold into the current. The silence between them was unhurried, filled only by the rhythm of hooves and the wind threading through dry branches. Gideon didn't talk much while riding, and Hattie didn't fill the space with words that weren't needed. When they reached the ridge, she reined in and turned toward the valley. "It's strange," she said, "being up high, like the world's not pressing in so close." Gideon looked at her, the way she sat tall in the saddle though her hands trembled slightly at the reins. "You're not meant to live pressed in." She didn't answer, but her gaze lingered on the distance. Back at the loft, she rolled her sleeves and started scrubbing the floorboards with soap and water she'd drawn without instruction. Gideon watched her from the doorway, the way she knelt without complaint, sleeves damp, hair falling forward. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was just trying to belong somewhere again. "You don't have to work yourself raw," he said. She wrung out the cloth. "I like knowing I've done something with my hands." He stepped inside, boots thudding softly on the cleaned boards. "You want to stay longer than a few days," she stood, brushing her palms on her skirt. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether I'm welcome." "You are," she met his eyes. "Then yes, I want to stay." He nodded once, the words caught somewhere behind his ribs. That evening, she cooked beans over the stove, humming low under her breath. Gideon carved a handle for a broken drawer, listening without letting on. After they ate, she mended one of his shirts by lamplight, her stitches small and neat. "You sew like someone who learned from a woman who didn't praise much," he said. "My aunt. She'd slap the back of my hand if the thread ran crooked. She'd be quiet tonight then." Hattie smiled without showing her teeth. "She'd find something." Later, when he stepped out to check the sky, he found her on the porch, arms wrapped around herself. The moon was thin, clouds trailing slow behind it. "I used to make up stories when I couldn't sleep," she said suddenly, "about places I'd go. Names I'd use." "What kind of names?" "Ones that didn't belong to anyone else, something clean." "You don't need another name anymore." She turned to him. "Why not?" "Because this one's yours. And you've worn it through worse than most folk could bear." She looked at him then the way someone might look at a fire after too long in the cold, not trusting it yet. But drawn just the same, he didn't touch her, didn't move closer. He just stood with her under the stars, letting the quiet do the work words couldn't. Inside, she folded the blanket over the cot again without being asked. He didn't offer her the bed. She didn't ask for it. But he left the stove burning longer than usual, and she noticed. Before the lantern went out, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't say anything back, but his breath stayed steady just on the other side of the room, and that was enough. By morning, the valley had its first frost, and Hattie was still there, still choosing to be. The frost stayed 3 days before the sun softened it, turning the earth slick beneath the hooves of horses and the boots of early risers. Gideon mucked stalls before breakfast, his coat open at the collar, steam rising from every breath. When he returned to the loft, Hattie was sitting at the table, needle flashing through a length of canvas she'd cut from an old grain sack. "You making something?" Gideon asked, brushing hay from his sleeves. "A satchel," she said, not lifting her eyes. "The kind that ties across the chest. Thought you might need one next time you ride out with more than your pockets can carry." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her knot the thread with a turn of her wrist. "You always work this early. I sleep better when I've done something useful before noon." She tied off the final stitch and set the satchel aside. Her hands were red from the chill, knuckles raw where the skin had cracked. She winced when she flexed her fingers. "You need salve," he said. "I'll ride out to the homestead downriver. Mrs. Elwell keeps lard and beeswax enough for the whole town. I can go." "You'll stay," he said gently. "That trail's narrow and still iced through the pine stretch. I don't trust it on a single horse." Hattie didn't argue, but her jaw worked like she wanted to. When he left, she swept the floor and boiled water for washing. Then she ventured out behind the livery to the small coop where a half-dozen hens scratched at the frozen ground. She held one gently, checked its feet, then let it go. The chickens weren't hers, but she'd begun tending them anyway, same as she did the cracked windows and the warped floorboards. She moved through the place like someone planting roots where they hadn't been asked to grow. By late afternoon, Gideon returned with a tin of salve and a wrapped parcel from Mrs. Elwell, who'd insisted he take a jar of preserved plums for the girl with the hollow eyes. Hattie raised her brows when he handed it to her. "I don't like plums," she said. "You'll eat them," he replied. She gave him with care. That evening they sat side by side on the porch steps, knees nearly brushing, watching a fox pick its way across the far edge of the field. Neither spoke for a long while. Hattie held the tin of salve in her lap, unopened. "I used to think kindness meant someone was going to want something from me," she said finally. "I don't." "I know, that's the strange part." Gideon looked at her profile, the way the dusk softened the lines of her face. "You ever think about staying longer than the season?" She nodded once. "I'd be lying if I said I hadn't." The wind stirred her hair, lifting a strand across her cheek. She didn't brush it away. "I ain't always been good at staying," he said. "Used to ride till I couldn't feel the weight of things. You feel it now," he hesitated. "Yeah." "I do." She turned toward him then, the space between them thinner than it had ever been. "That scare you?" "Not as much as it used to." Hattie reached into her skirt pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "Found this under the floorboard, looks old." He took it, unfolded it slow. It was a child's drawing stick figures, a crooked house, a sun with too many rays, faded pencil, edges warped from time. "Probably belonged to whoever lived here before," Hattie said. "Funny how things get left behind." Gideon stared at the drawing for a long moment, then tucked it into his coat. "Not everything worth keeping gets taken with you." They didn't go back inside right away. The stars came out one by one and the cold deepened around them, but neither moved. She leaned her shoulder into his, just enough to feel the warmth through the fabric. He didn't pull away. "I used to dream about running," she said, voice low. "Now I dream about staying." He laid his hand gently over hers and she didn't flinch. "You're safe now," he said. She turned her hand under his, lacing her fingers through his own. "I believe you." And for the first time she did. The first Saturday of October came with a pale sky and a wind that carried wood smoke through the streets of White Hollow. Gideon stood near the forge, waiting on a new bit for the mare's bridle, while Hattie walked the length of the market row where traders had gathered from the outlying farms. Her shawl was pulled tight, her boots caked with dust from the trail they'd walked in together. He watched her pause at a table of dried herbs and pick up a bundle of yarrow, running her thumb along the stalks like she was remembering something she hadn't spoken aloud yet. When she returned to him, she held out the bundle. "Can help with scrapes and swelling. Thought we could keep some on hand. You know how to use it," my mother did. She taught me before her lungs gave out. They started back toward the livery with a quiet ease between them. Hattie didn't speak again until they were halfway down the slope behind the church, where the trail narrowed and the trees grew close. "I saw the man," she said, her voice even. "The one who left me in the alley that night." Gideon stopped walking. "When?" "Earlier, in front of the millinery. He was talking with a man in a brown coat, didn't see me." "Did he look like he was staying put?" "No, he's moving through, but he's still close." He looked at her carefully. "You feel safe going back to the loft?" "I do." Now, they walked the rest of the way without speaking, but when they reached the stall where the mare was tied, Gideon turned to her. "If he shows his face again, I won't let it pass." "I know," she said, "but I don't want to be someone that needs avenging. I'd rather be someone who's hard to scare. You already are." That night, Hattie set a basin on the table and began soaking the yarrow. Gideon pulled a chair beside her, setting down an old jar without a label. "Found this in the shed behind the smithy," he said. "Smells like turpentine and linseed, might be good for oiling the saddle." She dipped a clean cloth into the water, folded it, and laid it across the rim of the basin. "I didn't think I'd ever sit at a table like this again, not without feeling watched." "No one's watching now," he said. "Just me. And I'm here because I want to be." She turned her face slightly. "You always that plain-spoken." "Not always, but you're not someone I want to lie to." Her eyes held his for a moment, then dropped to her hands. "I keep thinking about how I used to disappear in a room, just go quiet. Make myself small so no one notice I didn't belong. You belong here." He said it without pause. "You belong wherever you decide to stand." A log shifted in the stove behind them, cracking softly in the heat. Hattie reached over and pressed her hand gently against his wrist. "Would you mind if I stayed through winter?" she asked. "I can trade work for board. I can sew, keep the fire going, help with feed. I don't want to be idle." "I'd be glad for your company," he said, "but you're not trading me anything." "You're welcome because you matter to me." Her hand didn't move. "You don't say things unless you mean them." "No," he said. "I don't." She nodded once, then stood and moved toward the shelf, pulling down a tin cup. "I'll make us tea." They sat by the stove, their chairs pulled close, steam curling between them. Neither reached for the other, but the silence grew warmer. When she rose to go to her cot, Gideon stood too. "You don't have to sleep on the floor anymore," she said softly. "I told you I'd give you space." "I'm not asking for space tonight." He met her gaze, steady and quiet. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She took his hand, not shy, not hesitant, just certain. They laid together under the quilt, facing one another, her forehead pressed to his collarbone, his arm curved around her waist. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She breathed in, slow and steady, and let herself be held. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows and moved on. Inside, everything was still. Gideon closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of her breath. And for the first time in years, he didn't think about leaving. By the end of October, snow had started to collect in the gullies below White Hollow, thin and patchy, but enough to warn what would come. Gideon cleared the path to the stable each morning with a shovel he'd repaired, using a length of pine and 2 bent nails. Hattie took to stacking firewood under the eaves and sewing fresh lining into their coats by lantern light. They moved easily now, like 2 hands learning to work the same task separate, but in rhythm. One afternoon, while Gideon saw to the mare's hoof she'd stepped awkward on a stone, Hattie came down from the loft with a slip of paper folded neatly in her palm. "Your writing's clearer than mine," she said. "Could I ask you to read this with me?" He wiped his hands on a rag, then took the paper. The ink was pale but legible. "It's a legal notice," he said slowly. "Land auction. Says it's for the parcel behind the livery." His brow furrowed. "Didn't know that land was up for sale." "I asked the clerk at the mercantile," she said. "He said the previous claim lapsed after the widow passed. No heirs. It's government held now." Gideon looked at her. "You thinking of buying it? If I had the means, I would. It's good soil and it gets morning sun." He folded the letter, thoughtful. "You'd want to stay here long enough to make use of it." "I would," she said, "if I had reason to." He tucked the paper into his pocket. "And if someone matched the bid for you," she crossed her arms, gaze steady. "I'd want to contribute. I won't be someone's kept thing." "You'd be my partner," he said. "Not a kept anything." That night, Gideon walked to the courthouse and put down a bid using the money he'd saved from years of horse trading jobs across the territory. When he returned, he found Hattie asleep in the rocker, a bit of mending still caught between her fingers. He lifted the cloth gently from her lap and covered her with a quilt. The next morning, when he told her the land was theirs, she didn't answer right away. She stepped out onto the porch and stood in the brittle sunlight, arms wrapped around herself. "I never had anything that belonged to me," she said. "Not a key, not a corner of a room, not until now." He joined her, pressing the folded deed into her hands. "It's yours as much as mine." She looked up at him, quiet tears in her eyes. "I want to build something with you. Then we'll build it." Over the next weeks, they cleared brush. Gideon felled trees with a borrowed axe and Hattie stripped bark from the smaller trunks. She made a ledger of what they'd need: nails, a hand saw, canvas for a temporary roof. They traded winter preserves for lumber scraps, and when Gideon injured his hand, Hattie packed the wound with yarrow and wrapped it tight. They built a small dwelling, first a single room, stone hearth, narrow windows. Hattie laid the floorboards herself, tongue clamped between her teeth, sleeves rolled high. Gideon cut a table from cedar and planed it smooth with his good hand. By December, they'd moved in. On the night the first full snow fell, Hattie lit a fire and set a kettle of beans to warm. Gideon came in from the shed, frost clinging to his collar. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. He knelt beside the fire, untying his boots. "I do. I want to be your wife," she said simply. He looked up at her, his hands still. "You sure? I've never been more." He stood, walked to her, and took her hands in his. "Then let's be married come spring. I'll build you a porch with room for a rocking chair and a garden in back." "I want it all," she said, her breath catching. "The mornings, the quiet, the work. I want it with you." He kissed her then, not rushed, not shy, just steady and full, like every part of him had waited for that single moment. She leaned into him, arms around his neck, and neither of them let go for a long time. They were married in March, inside the church where the wind whistled soft through the eaves. Hattie wore a dress she'd made herself, lace-stitched along the collar. Gideon stood beside her in his best shirt, sleeves pressed, hair combed flat, Mrs. Elwell brought a pie, and the blacksmith's wife played a hymn on a fiddle so old it barely held tune. But it was enough. That evening, they returned home to the little house they'd built with their own hands. Gideon lit the lantern, and Hattie poured warm water into the basin by the hearth. They didn't need to speak much. There was comfort now in the way she moved around him, brushing her hand along his spine as she passed, or the way he reached for her shoulder in the dark, just to know she was there. They planted potatoes that year, and cabbage and beans. Hattie kept the ledger, and Gideon took work training horses through the summer. They saved for a milk cow, and in time, a second room on clear nights, they sat on the porch beneath the stars, fingers laced, boots resting side by side. They didn't talk about what had come before. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered was in the quiet between them, and so they lived together, steady and full of the kind of love that asks nothing but presence and gives everything in return.